The morning of October 13th, 1991, dawned crisp and clear in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa. The maple trees lining Elm Street had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson, their leaves rustling gently in the autumn breeze. 8-year-old Jessica Parker adjusted her navy blue dress as she walked hand in hand with her younger brother, 6-year-old Tommy. Their mother, Linda, had sent them ahead to St. Matthew's Lutheran Church for the children's choir practice that preceded the Sunday service, just as she had done every week for the past 2 years. The Parker family lived only 4 blocks from the church, a route so familiar that Jessica could navigate it with her eyes closed, past the Hendersons' white picket fence, around the corner where old Mr. Kowalski always sat on his porch reading the paper, and straight down Church Street until the steeple came into view. It was a journey that should have taken no more than 8 minutes, even with Tommy's tendency to stop and examine every interesting rock or fallen leaf along the way. Before we continue with this story that has haunted Cedar Falls for over 3 decades, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light, and we love connecting with viewers from around the world. Linda Parker checked the kitchen clock at 9:47 a.m., noting that the children should have arrived at church by now. She finished washing the breakfast dishes, humming the melody of Amazing Grace that Jessica had been practicing all week. The church service wasn't until 10:30, but Reverend William Matthews always encouraged the children to arrive early for their rehearsal. Linda planned to walk over herself in about 20 minutes after she finished preparing the potato salad for the church potluck lunch. At exactly 10:15 a.m., the phone rang. It was Dorothy Matthews, the Reverend's wife, and her voice carried an unusual tension. "Linda, dear, are the children feeling well today? We haven't seen Jessica and Tommy yet, and practice started 15 minutes ago." The words hit Linda like a physical blow. Her hands began to shake as she gripped the phone receiver. "They left the house at 9:35, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "They should have been there by now." Within minutes, Linda was running down Elm Street, retracing her children's route while calling their names. The beautiful autumn morning suddenly felt ominous, the cheerful colors of the changing leaves now seeming to mock her growing panic. She knocked on every door along the way, asking neighbors if they had seen Jessica and Tommy. Mrs. Henderson, who was raking leaves in her front yard, confirmed she had seen them pass by around 9:40, walking normally and chatting with each other as they always did. By 11 a.m., half the congregation had joined the search. Reverend Matthews cancelled the service, and the sanctuary that should have been filled with hymns and prayers instead became a makeshift command center. The Cedar Falls Police Department dispatched every available officer, and by noon, the Iowa State Police had been contacted. Detective Ray Morrison, a 20-year veteran with the department, took charge of the investigation. He had handled missing persons cases before, but something about the Parker children's disappearance felt different from the start. The search expanded methodically throughout the afternoon. Volunteers combed through Riverside Park, where the children sometimes played, and searched every garage, shed, and abandoned building in a 6-block radius. The local fire department brought in tracking dogs, but the trail seemed to vanish completely at the corner of Church Street and Maple Avenue, just 2 blocks from St. Matthew's. It was as if Jessica and Tommy had simply evaporated into the crisp October air. As evening approached, the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team arrived from Des Moines. Special Agent Rebecca Santos, a specialist in child disappearances, set up an incident room at the Cedar Falls Police Department. She interviewed Linda Parker for 3 hours, going over every detail of the children's routines, their friends, any strangers who might have been in the area recently. Linda's husband David, who worked the night shift at the John Deere factory, had been sleeping when the children left for church. He awoke to find his world completely shattered. The first week passed in a blur of search parties, media interviews, and sleepless nights. Flyers with Jessica and Tommy's smiling faces appeared on every telephone pole and storefront window in Cedar Falls. The local newspaper, the Cedar Falls Gazette, ran the story on the front page every day. Television crews from Des Moines and even Chicago arrived to cover what was becoming Iowa's most high-profile missing children case in years. Detective Morrison worked 18-hour days, following every lead, no matter how insignificant it seemed. A gas station attendant reported seeing two children matching the description getting into a blue sedan with out-of-state plates. A farmer 20 miles south claimed to have heard children's voices crying for help near his property. Each lead was pursued with methodical determination, but none yielded any concrete evidence. The psychological toll on the Parker family was devastating. Linda stopped eating regularly and lost 15 pounds in the first month. David took indefinite leave from his job, unable to concentrate on anything but finding his children. Their marriage, once solid and loving, began to strain under the incredible pressure and grief. Well-meaning friends and relatives offered comfort, but nothing could fill the gaping hole left by Jessica and Tommy's absence. 3 months into the investigation, the case began to attract national attention. The Parker family appeared on several television talk shows, pleading for any information about their children. A reward fund, started by the congregation at St. Matthew's, had grown to over $50,000 thanks to donations from across the country. Despite the massive media coverage and the unprecedented search effort involving hundreds of law enforcement officers and volunteers, Jessica and Tommy Parker seemed to have vanished without a trace. The investigation revealed several troubling details that hadn't been immediately apparent. In the weeks leading up to the disappearance, neighbors reported seeing an unfamiliar dark-colored van parked at various locations around the neighborhood. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, who lived 3 houses down from the Parkers, mentioned to police that she had noticed the van parked across from her home at least 4 times in the 2 weeks before October 13th. Each time, she observed a single occupant who appeared to be watching the street, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. More disturbing was the discovery that Cedar Falls had experienced a series of minor incidents involving children in the months prior to Jessica and Tommy's disappearance. Several parents reported that strangers had approached their children at the local park, offering candy or asking for help finding a lost puppy. In one incident, a 9-year-old girl named Amanda Foster told her parents that a man in a baseball cap had followed her for 3 blocks as she walked home from school, only turning away when she reached her front door. Detective Morrison began to suspect that the Parker children's disappearance wasn't a random crime of opportunity, but rather the culmination of a predator's careful surveillance and planning. This theory was supported by the fact that whoever had taken Jessica and Tommy had chosen a time and route that minimized the chances of witnesses, yet still required intimate knowledge of the children's weekly routine. As autumn turned to winter, the search continued, but with diminishing intensity. The FBI maintained their involvement, but other cases demanded attention. The Cedar Falls community, while still supportive of the Parker family, gradually returned to their normal routines. The yellow ribbons that had adorned trees throughout the town began to fade and tear in the harsh Iowa winter wind. Linda Parker struggled with severe depression and began seeing a therapist recommended by Reverend Matthews. David threw himself into his own investigation, creating elaborate charts and timelines in their basement, convinced that law enforcement was missing some crucial piece of evidence. The basement became his obsession, walls covered with maps, photographs, and newspaper clippings related to the case. Friends worried that David was losing his grip on reality, but Linda understood his need to feel like he was doing something, anything, to bring their children home. The first anniversary of the disappearance was marked by a candlelight vigil at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. Over 300 people attended, including families from neighboring towns who had been touched by the story. Reverend Matthews led prayers for Jessica and Tommy's safe return, while Linda and David Parker stood holding hands, their faces etched with the pain of 12 months of uncertainty and loss. Detective Morrison, despite having worked on dozens of other cases since October 1991, continued to review the Parker file regularly. He had developed a personal connection to the case that went beyond professional duty. Late at night, when the station was quiet, he would spread out all the evidence on his desk, searching for the one detail that everyone had somehow overlooked. He interviewed and re-interviewed witnesses, followed up on tips that came in sporadically from around the country, and maintained correspondence with other law enforcement agencies about similar cases. As the years passed, the Parker case became one of those heartbreaking mysteries that defined a community. Cedar Falls was forever changed by the loss of Jessica and Tommy Parker. Parents became more protective of their children. The innocence of letting kids walk unsupervised to church or school was replaced by constant vigilance and fear. The town's sense of security, built over generations of peaceful small-town life, had been shattered in a single morning. The case went cold, but it never truly died. Every few years, a new detective would be assigned to review the file, bringing fresh eyes to old evidence. Advances in forensic technology led to periodic re-examination of physical evidence, though little had been recovered from the scene. The FBI's database grew more sophisticated, allowing for better comparison with similar cases across the country. But still, no breakthrough came. David Parker never stopped searching. He became a fixture at missing children conferences and law enforcement seminars, networking with other families of missing children and private investigators. He learned about investigative techniques, legal procedures, and the dark world of child predators. His basement office expanded to include multiple filing cabinets filled with correspondence, tip sheets, and research materials. Some might have called it an obsession, but David preferred to think of it as dedication to his children. Linda found her own way to cope through community service. She volunteered at the local crisis center, helping other families navigate the aftermath of trauma and loss. She became an advocate for missing children, working with legislators to improve Amber Alert systems and support services for affected families. Her grief transformed into a powerful force for change, though the pain of losing Jessica and Tommy never diminished. The congregation at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church created a memorial garden in honor of Jessica and Tommy Parker. 2 small angel statues were placed among carefully tended flowers and a bench where visitors could sit and remember. Every year on October 13th, fresh flowers were placed at the memorial and special prayers were offered during the Sunday service. The children's choir, of which Jessica had been such an enthusiastic member, dedicated their annual Christmas concert to their memory. As the 20th anniversary of the disappearance approached in 2011, Detective Morrison, now a captain, received an unexpected phone call that would reignite the investigation. The caller was Dr. Patricia Walsh, an archaeologist from the University of Iowa, who had been leading a historical preservation project at the site of an old railway depot on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. The depot had been abandoned since the 1960s, and the area was being surveyed before new commercial development began. Dr. Walsh explained that her team had discovered what appeared to be a makeshift shelter in the basement of the old depot building. Hidden behind a false wall that had been constructed with considerable skill, they found evidence that someone had lived there for an extended period. Most significantly, they had discovered personal items that appeared to belong to children, including clothing and toys that could date to the early 1990s. Within hours of Dr. Walsh's call, the site was secured as a potential crime scene. Captain Morrison, despite having retired from active investigation, was granted special permission to participate in the excavation. The Cedar Falls Police Department, working in conjunction with the Iowa State Police and FBI, began a methodical examination of the hidden room beneath the depot. The space was larger than initially thought, extending back under the main floor of the building and accessible through a cleverly concealed entrance. Forensic archaeologists worked alongside crime scene specialists to carefully document and recover every piece of evidence. The room contained a crude but functional living space with sleeping areas, storage for food and water, and even a small ventilation system that connected to the building's original air shafts. Most disturbing were the personal effects they found. Children's clothing in sizes that could have fit Jessica and Tommy Parker, though nothing that could be definitively identified as belonging to them. Books and small toys, including a wooden cross that Linda Parker later identified as similar to ones given to children in the St. Matthew's Sunday School program. The items were carefully preserved and subjected to the most advanced forensic testing available, including DNA analysis that had been impossible in 1991. The discovery raised as many questions as it answered. Who had constructed this elaborate hiding place? And when? Had Jessica and Tommy been held here, and if so, for how long? The forensic evidence suggested the space had been used intermittently over many years, possibly decades. Carbon dating of organic materials found in the room indicated activity ranging from the 1970s through the mid-1990s, but pinpointing specific timeframes proved challenging. Investigation into the history of the depot revealed that it had been owned by various entities since the railway ceased operations. For most of the 1980s and early 1990s, it had been nominally owned by a development company based in Chicago, but the property had been effectively abandoned and unsecured. Local teenagers had been known to explore the building occasionally, though none reported seeing evidence of the hidden room. Captain Morrison assembled a new investigative team, combining veteran detectives with specialists in cold case analysis and forensic archaeology. They began the painstaking process of re-examining every aspect of the original investigation in light of the depot discovery. Witnesses who had been interviewed decades earlier were contacted again, though many had died or moved away from Cedar Falls. The case file, which had grown to fill several boxes over the years, was digitized and subjected to advanced data analysis techniques. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Among the items recovered from the depot was a collection of handwritten notes and sketches that appeared to be some kind of journal or record-keeping system. The writing was in a distinctive script, and the content was partially coded or written in a cipher that initially baffled investigators. The FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit was consulted, and after weeks of analysis, they began to decipher the hidden meaning in the writings. The decoded messages revealed the disturbing thoughts and plans of someone who had been observing and tracking children in Cedar Falls and surrounding communities for years. The entries included detailed descriptions of children's routines, schools they attended, and family schedules. Most chilling was an entry dated October 10, 1991, just 3 days before Jessica and Tommy's disappearance, describing two subjects who walked to church every Sunday morning, unaccompanied, route predictable, optimal time window available. The journal also contained references to other children who had gone missing from small towns across Iowa and neighboring states during the 1980s and early 1990s. As investigators cross-referenced these cases, a pattern began to emerge. At least 7 children from rural communities had vanished under similar circumstances during this time period. All were between the ages of 6 and 10. All had disappeared while traveling short distances alone or with siblings, and none of the cases had ever been solved. The scope of the investigation expanded dramatically as law enforcement agencies across the Midwest were contacted. The FBI established a multi-jurisdictional task force to coordinate the investigation into what appeared to be the work of a serial predator who had operated across several states for years. The Parker case, which had once seemed like an isolated tragedy, was now understood to be part of a much larger and more horrifying pattern of crimes. As 2023 approached, 32 years after Jessica and Tommy Parker first failed to arrive at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, investigative reporter Michael Chen from the Des Moines Register began working on a comprehensive feature story about the case. Chen had covered missing persons cases throughout his career, but the Parker disappearance had always held particular interest for him. He spent months interviewing family members, law enforcement officials, and community members who had been affected by the case. During his research, Chen discovered a lead that had somehow been overlooked in previous investigations. While reviewing old property records for the depot and surrounding area, he found reference to a caretaker who had been employed sporadically by various property owners during the 1980s and early 1990s. The man, identified as Frank Kowalski, had been hired to perform basic maintenance and security services for several abandoned or underutilized properties in the Cedar Falls area. The name struck Chen as familiar, and after cross-referencing his notes, he realized this was likely the same Kowalski family that had lived on Elm Street, along the route that Jessica and Tommy had taken to church. Old Mr. Kowalski, who had been known for sitting on his porch reading the newspaper every morning, had died in 1998, but Chen wondered if there might be a connection through family members. Further investigation revealed that Frank Kowalski was the son of the elderly man who had lived on Elm Street. Frank had struggled with employment and had a history of minor legal troubles, including arrests for trespassing and public intoxication. Most significantly, he had abruptly left Cedar Falls in November 1991, just weeks after Jessica and Tommy's disappearance, telling neighbors he was moving to Arizona to care for a sick relative. Chen brought his findings to Captain Morrison, who immediately recognized the potential significance of this new lead. A nationwide search was initiated to locate Frank Kowalski, now in his 60s, if still alive. The search proved challenging, as Kowalski had lived a transient lifestyle, moving frequently and often working under aliases. However, modern database searches and social media investigations eventually traced him to a small town in Northern California, where he had been living under a slightly modified version of his name. When California authorities located Kowalski in early 2024, they found him living alone in a rundown trailer on the outskirts of Redwood City. He was suffering from advanced emphysema and appeared to be in poor health overall. When confronted with questions about his time in Cedar Falls and the disappearance of the Parker children, Kowalski initially denied any knowledge of the case. However, when presented with evidence from the depot investigation, including handwriting analysis that suggested he was the author of the coded journal, his demeanor changed dramatically. Over the course of several interviews conducted with medical supervision due to his deteriorating health, Kowalski gradually began to admit his involvement in the Parker case. He confirmed that he had been living intermittently in the hidden room beneath the depot, using it as a base of operations for what he called his collection activities. He had been observing children throughout the Cedar Falls area for months before targeting Jessica and Tommy Parker. According to Kowalski's confession, he had approached the children as they walked to church on October 13, 1991, telling them he was a friend of their father who had been asked to drive them to church because their mother had been suddenly taken ill. Jessica and Tommy, trusting and well-mannered as they had been raised to be, accepted his explanation and got into his van willingly. What followed was every parent's worst nightmare. Kowalski held the children at the depot for several days, during which time the massive search effort was underway throughout Cedar Falls. He claimed that he had intended to release them after the initial search efforts died down, but became increasingly paranoid as the investigation intensified and media coverage spread nationwide. His plans, whatever they might have been originally, spiraled beyond his control. The most heartbreaking revelation came when Kowalski admitted that both children had died within a week of their abduction, not from intentional violence, but from exposure and neglect in the poorly heated and ventilated basement room. He had been unprepared for the logistics of keeping two young children alive in such primitive conditions, and their deaths had apparently shocked even him. Fearing capture and prosecution for murder, he had disposed of their bodies and fled to California. When pressed for details about where Jessica and Tommy had been buried, Kowalski's answers became vague and inconsistent. He claimed to have panic-buried them somewhere in the woods outside Cedar Falls, but could not or would not provide specific locations. Investigators suspected that his memory might be genuinely impaired by decades of alcohol abuse and his current medical condition, or that he was still protecting himself by withholding crucial information. Frank Kowalski died in custody 3 weeks after his confession, succumbing to complications from his respiratory illness before he could be transported back to Iowa for formal charges. His death left investigators with partial answers, but also new questions about the exact circumstances of Jessica and Tommy's final days and the location of their remains. The confession had provided closure regarding what had happened to the children, but the Parker family's hope of bringing their children home for a proper burial remained unfulfilled. The news of Kowalski's confession and death sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls and the wider community that had followed the case for over 3 decades. Linda Parker, now in her 70s, struggled with conflicting emotions of relief at finally knowing the truth and profound grief at learning the horrific details of her children's final days. David Parker, whose health had declined significantly during the long years of searching, found some measure of peace in knowing that the uncertainty was finally over. In a strange turn of events that would provide the final piece of the Parker puzzle, a discovery was made in the spring of 2024 during renovation work at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. The congregation had decided to update the church's heating system, which required extensive work in the basement and storage areas that hadn't been thoroughly examined in many years. Workers demolishing an old furnace room found a hidden compartment behind a false wall, similar to the one discovered at the depot. Inside this compartment, wrapped carefully in plastic and preserved by the dry conditions of the church basement, were Jessica and Tommy Parker's church hymnals. The small books, with their names written in careful childhood script on the inside covers, also contained pressed flowers and small drawings that the children had made during church services. Most significantly, tucked between the pages of Jessica's hymnal was a brief note, apparently written in her own handwriting, that read, "We are scared, but we are together. We love Mommy and Daddy. Jesus will take care of us." The discovery of the hymnals raised new questions about the timeline and circumstances of the children's disappearance. How had these items ended up hidden in the church basement, and when had they been placed there? Forensic analysis of the note and the condition of the books suggested they had been in the church for many years, possibly since shortly after the children's disappearance. Investigators theorized that Kowalski might have taken the hymnals from Jessica and Tommy during their captivity and later hidden them in the church as some kind of twisted trophy or memento. The church had been searched multiple times during the initial investigation, but the compartment where the hymnals were found had been behind a boiler that was never moved during the original searches. It was possible that Kowalski, who had worked as a maintenance person and had access to various buildings in town, had hidden the items there during the weeks following the abduction. The discovery of the hymnals, 32 years after Jessica and Tommy Parker first failed to arrive at church, provided a final connection between the children and the place where they had been heading on that October morning in 1991. For the Parker family and the Cedar Falls community, the small books represented both a precious link to the lost children and a symbol of their enduring faith and love, even in the face of unimaginable terror. Reverend Matthews, now retired but still living in Cedar Falls, held a special memorial service when the hymnals were returned to the church. The congregation, many of whom had participated in the original search efforts, gathered to remember Jessica and Tommy, and to find what comfort they could in finally understanding the fate of the two children who had touched so many lives. The hymnals were placed in a memorial case in the church sanctuary, where they serve as a permanent reminder of the children whose disappearance changed their community forever. Linda Parker, speaking at the memorial service, reflected on the long journey from that terrible morning in 1991 to the bittersweet closure of 2024. While she and David would never recover from the loss of their children, she expressed gratitude for the dedicated law enforcement officers, volunteers, and community members who had never given up hope of finding answers. The discovery of the hymnals, she said, proved that Jessica and Tommy's memory would live on and that their story had meaning beyond the tragedy of their deaths. The Parker case became a landmark in the study of cold case investigations, demonstrating how advances in forensic science, changes in information sharing between law enforcement agencies, and the dedication of investigators could eventually solve even the most challenging mysteries. Detective Morrison, now fully retired, often spoke at law enforcement conferences about the importance of never giving up on missing children cases, no matter how much time had passed. For the town of Cedar Falls, the resolution of the Parker case marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in their community's history. While the pain of loss would never fully heal, there was some comfort in knowing that justice had been served, even if it came too late to save Jessica and Tommy. The memorial garden at St. Matthew's Church continued to be tended by volunteers, and the annual remembrance service remained an important tradition for the community. The story of Jessica and Tommy Parker serves as a reminder that even in small, seemingly safe communities, vigilance is necessary to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Their disappearance prompted changes in how children were supervised, how law enforcement agencies cooperated across jurisdictional lines, and how communities responded to missing persons cases. While their lives were cut tragically short, the impact of their story continued to resonate 3 decades later, ensuring that their memory would endure and that their deaths were not in vain.